24, and we are on Chaf Gimel Amid Beis 23b. We saw machlokes between Chizkiah and Rabbi Abo as the source for how do we know that chametz is asur ba'hana, is prohibited in benefit. Chizkiah learns it from the fact that it says lo ye'achel, it shall not be eaten in the reflexive, in regards to chametz, which tells us that it cannot be the source of any income, which is then going to feed us. And that means you may not have benefit from it. And Rabbi Abo says a general rule when the Torah says lo yochel l'sechel l'sechlu, it means a prohibition of hana as well. And the Gemara said that the distinction or the relevance of these rules that Rabbi Abo and Chizkiah said in regards to chametz, it's in regards to shor haniskel, which is a ox that gored that was sentenced to be put down, and in regards to chulin shenishchatu ba'azara. Chulin is a mundane animal, non-kodesh, that was brought into the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash and shechted there. So that's the two opinions we have in Chizkiah and Rabbi Abo. The Gemara now brings another opinion, which is the opinion of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, is the source, his source for the prohibition of hana. Where does he know the Isser hana? The Gemara is going to give multiple attempts, but it revolves around a concept in learning where if the Torah tells us specifically a certain mitzvah, that there's a prohibition there, and that prohibition is superfluous, it must be telling us something more general about another thing that's similar that prohibition would apply to. This is called an eina inyan la'atzma. If it's not needed for itself because it's clear already, then it's telling us something more general and therefore applicable to something else. And we're going to see the multiple attempts of doing so in order to tell us the source of chametz, of Isser Hana, that when the Torah says something's prohibited to be eaten, it means it's prohibited to be benefited from. Yasef Ahu Mirabanan. So a certain one of the Chachamim asked, Kamei Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, in front of Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani. And he said to him, how do we know? What's the source? And he said, in the name of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, how do we know that a general rule for Torah prohibitions, if the Torah prohibits it to be eaten, it's prohibited to be benefited from as well? And so this is addressing what both Chizkiah and Rabbi Abo had addressed. And Chizkiah said, so when the Torah says lo ye'achel, when it's written in a specific way in the reflexive, and Rabbi Abo said it in a general term, that's what the Torah means. And his source was from nevela, from the fact that by nevela, an animal that was not shechted properly, the Torah said that you can gift it to your neighbor ger toshav, or to sell it to a foreigner. So the Gemara says, "Am I new?" And what, in regards to what would this be relevant to know that that when the Torah says prohibited to be eaten, it means prohibited to be benefited from. In regards to chametz b'Pesach, chametz on Pesach, shor haniskel, and a ox that gored and was sentenced to be put down. Minai. So Gemara says, wait, why are you asking this question? Typically, why don't we say that from the fact that it says lo yachel in the reflexive, like Chizkiah says? Gemara says lo yachel is achila mashma isanor la mashma. No, he doesn't agree to the idea that that because it's written in lo yachel that it cannot be a source of food for you in any way, and even if you sell it and then use the money to buy something else, that would be prohibited. It doesn't say so. He doesn't understand the meaning that way, and therefore he disagrees with Chizkiah. Typically, nevela. Well, why didn't he follow Rabbi Abo's source, which says that nevela tells us that the fact that the Torah had to tell you you're allowed to gift it to your neighbor or sell it to someone else is indicative that generally when the Torah says that you cannot eat it, it means you're not allowed to even gift it or sell it. Sava Rabbi Yehuda. He says no. He follows the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar Dvarim Kichsava, that the reason the Torah told you that you're allowed to gift it to your friend, to your neighbor who's a ger toshav, or sell it to someone else is not on account of that. Otherwise, it would have been prohibited in benefit. No, the reason the Torah said that is because the Torah wanted to tell you that the Torah would rather we gift it to give it away for free to a ger toshav, our neighbor, in order to sustain our neighbor and who's committed to not live with idolatry, and to support them and keep them alive. So that's why the Torah said it. It's specific. Nesina le ger. It's best to give it to for free to the ger toshav rather than to sell it to someone else. And since the reason the Torah wrote it was not, since the Torah wrote it in order to give us the order of preference of how to dispose of the nevela, that tells us that we can't deduce that otherwise it would have been prohibited in benefit. The fact that the Torah says not to eat it only means you're not allowed to eat it. And why did the Torah need to tell me I can give it to someone else? It doesn't. It means to tell us that I must first try and give it to a ger toshav before I give it to someone else. So fine. So I don't have a source that indicates that the Torah would have that when the Torah says it's prohibited to be eaten, it's also prohibited for benefit. Isavalak Rabbi Yehuda. Well, earlier we had a source for Rabbi Yehuda as well. Typically, where Rabbi Yehuda learns it. The Torah says by terefa that you should throw it to the dog, meaning you benefit by the dog eating it. And so from the fact that the Torah said this can be given to the dog and nothing else, means other things that are prohibited in benefit that are prohibited to be eaten are also prohibited in benefit. Says no. Since we have an opinion that says that the prohibition of eating of benefiting from something that was shechted in the prohibition of something that was shechted non-kodesh, it was shechted in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. That non-kodesh, that chulin shenishchat ba'azara, is prohibited in benefit, and we learn it from this verse, from the Torah. The fact that the Torah says, "Ubasa basada treifa," meat that is out in the field, meaning it's out of its boundaries, it's not where it's supposed to be. Losachelu, you shall not eat. And then it says, "But lakelav tashlichin oso," and you can throw it to the dog. Terefa can be given to the dog, and however, the chulin shenishchat ba'azara, the mundane animal, the non-sanctified animal that was brought into the courtyard and shechted there, that you're not allowed to benefit from, and that's a Torah prohibition. And so that's what the word osa is coming to tell you, that trefa is allowed to be given to a dog, but a chulin shenishchat ba'azara, that which is outside of its boundary, may not be benefited from. So therefore, we're back to the question: how to, according to Rabbi Shua Levi, the question stands: how do we know the source of prohibition of chametz in benefit, as well as shor haniskel is prohibited in benefit? Minayin. So he says it's from this verse. The Torah says that a korban chatas. There are two types of korban chatas. There's a chatas apnim and chatas achitzon, an inner chatas and an outer chatas. The inner chatas offering, which is a sin offering, is meant to be brought. The blood is brought into the Beis Hamikdash itself, whereas generally the blood of a chatas is spritzed on the outer mizbeach, and it's shechted in the outer mizbeach. So here the Torah says, the pasuk, on the outer chatas, the chatas achitzon, kol chatas asher yuva midama. If a chatas has its blood brought inward into the kodesh, el oil panei el moed, inside the oil moed, lechaper by kodesh, lo say achel, it shall not be eaten. Be'esh tisarif, and it should be burned in fire. Now, so the burning in the fire obviously tells me that it's the burning in fire. If the fact that says that it can't be eaten, I know it has to be burned. The burning in the fire is superfluous because obviously, if it's burnt in the fire, as the Gemara can tell us later, once you burn it, you can't eat it, right? So it's superfluous. It doesn't have to tell me that it needs to be burned. And we already know that once something has left its place, it needs to be burned. So why do I have to tell me that it gets burned? So if it's not to tell me that this particular food, which may not be eaten, it has to be burned and may not have benefit from, Taneu Inyan, and why is it superfluous? Because we already have another pasuk in regards to the offering that came on the inauguration day of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Mishkan, on the day that Aaron lost his two sons, and Echatas had been burned. They burned the Chatas, and it says over there, V'hine Soraf, right? The Sorah Chatas, the goat of the Chatas offering, Moshe sought it out, and it had been burned. And Aaron explained to Moshe why it needed to be burned. But Moshe, in asking why it was burned, said, "Hein lahuva es dama el hakadosh panima." Its blood had not been brought into the holy itself; it was still outside on the mizbeach. So you see that if it had been brought in, that would have been reason to burn it. So we already know that it would be burned. So why did the Torah have to say specifically it should be burned? So it must be telling us a more general thing, that all prohibitions where the Torah says it's not allowed to be eaten, you have to burn it, you're not allowed to benefit from it. Because it's not needed for itself, because we already have Moshe telling Aaron that if it had been brought in to the inner chamber, into the Kodesh, it would have to be burnt. So now we go to Chaf Daled Amud Aleph. And it clearly is not coming to tell us that it needs to be burned and therefore it's prohibited in benefit, right? Taneu Inyan Isser Hana. It must be coming to tell me that it's that when the Torah says something is not allowed to be eaten, that you're not allowed to benefit from it and it needs to be burned. Well, if you're going to tell me that everything else is prohibited in benefit, perhaps it actually needs to be burned. Chametz would have to be burned. Sharaniska would have to be burned. Amar Kra, so he says, no, actually, it's not you don't have to burn it. Amar Kra ba'kodesh be'is tisarif, that which is holy needs to be burned. B'kodesh b'sreifa, ve'en kol isur shebetorah b'sreifa. But other prohibitions in the Torah that are prohibited in benefit as well, they don't have to be burnt. It's just the prohibition of benefit, but not in burnt. And does not need to be burnt. So that's the structure here. It says, by chatas, if you bring the blood into the Kodesh, that you may not eat it, and it needs to be burned. We already know it needs to be burned from the fact that Moshe tells Aaron, why did you burn this? The blood hadn't been brought into the inner sanctuary, into the Kodesh, which tells us that if it had been, that would be reason to burn it. So we know that it needs to be burned. So this is superfluous. It must be telling us something more general than itself, to tell us that in general, if something's prohibited in benefit to be eaten, it's also prohibited in benefit. However, it doesn't actually have to be burned if we're talking about other things, because if the Torah says something that is in Kodesh, that needs to be burned, and something that's not in the holy, not in the Kodesh, does not have to be burned. So the Gemara challenges and says, actually, this last verse that tells us that only that which is Kodesh needs to be burned is used for something else. Is it coming to teach us this idea that only Kachim needs to be burned and not other things? We need it for a teaching of Rabbi Shimon. The Tanya Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, the Brisa tells us that Rabbi Shimon says, "B'kodesh be'eshti sarif limed al chatash aserfenus b'kodesh." B'kodesh be'eshti sarif tells us where the burning has to take place of the chatas. We just said that the chatas needs to be burned. If the blood goes into the inner chamber, into the kodesh itself, not only in the courtyard, then the chatas needs to be burned. Where do you burn it? B'kodesh be'eshti sarif. It needs to be burned in the kodesh, in the courtyard itself, as opposed to shlamim, which is allowed to be eaten outside of the Beis Hamikdash and outside of the courtyard. You can eat it all of Yerushalayim, so you're going to burn it elsewhere. But this, being that it's kodesh, it needs to be burned in the kodesh. And perhaps that's only for the chatas. And how do we know also other parts of the kachim that are not supposed to be eaten or taken out of the courtyard, such as kodesh kadashim, kachim, a carbon that is holy to the level that it's supposed to be eaten in the a holy area. It can't eat it outside in Yerushalayim, or the innards and parts that go on the mizbeach, which also are not supposed to be taken out of the courtyard. So how do I know that too is supposed to be burned in the kodesh? Talmud loimer b'kodesh be'eshti sarif. That kodesh needs to be burned in the kodesh. Anything that's holy, meaning that not supposed to be taken out of the courtyard, is burnt in the courtyard if it became invalid. So that can't be the source to tell us that this is that everything else is prohibited in benefit but doesn't get burned. Amalei Rabbi Yonasan Rabacha Mehai Krak Amalei. So Rishua says to Shmuel ben Achmeni that the source is actually from this verse. It says in the pasuk, if the inauguration carbon, the inauguration offerings that were brought, if anything were to be left over from the meat of the carbon, or of the bread, if anything would be left until the morning, and you will burn the remainder in fire, and it shall not be eaten because it is holy. Now, the pasuk is superfluous. It doesn't have to tell me that you cannot eat it. It just told me that it needs to be burned. Of course I can't eat it. So why did the Torah have to tell me that I cannot eat it? It already says you should burn it. You may not eat it. Of course, if I should burn it, then I can't eat it. So therefore, it's not there to teach you about itself. And it already says that the remainder should be burned in fire, and that's a prior prohibition, the obligation. You have to burn it. So therefore, it must be coming tell you other prohibitions in the Torah, more general thing, that if you cannot eat it, it must be burnt. And since the Torah says it must be burned, and therefore you cannot eat it, it's telling you that something that cannot be eaten is prohibited in benefit, and to tell you that if you can't eat it, you must not benefit from it either. But back to this idea, well, then perhaps all prohibitions that you're not allowed to benefit from have to be burned. It's superfluous here in the verse. There's another word, superfluous. The Torah should have said, V'sarafta oso, and you will burn it, because the beginning of the verse already says, if anything is left over of the meat or the bread, you shall burn it. That would have been sufficient. But instead it says, and you shall burn the remainder. Well, we're talking about the remainder. So therefore it tells us other things are prohibited in benefit, just like this. However, the remainder of kachim need to be burned, but other things don't need to be burned. But other things that we're going to learn from here are prohibited in benefit, do not need to be burned. Now, the Gemara challenges this as well and says this verse of that the Besar Miluim, the leftover inauguration meat, may not be eaten, is coming to tell us that all prohibitions in the Torah have a prohibition of a benefit as well, but don't need to be burned. Is this what it's coming for? We need it for the teaching of Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar said, this is this verse in regards to the basar miluim, the leftover meat and bread that it may not be eaten, kol shebekodesh pasul. It's coming to tell you a general rule that any that anything that's holy, that's pigul, meaning an invalid kachim because you had the wrong intent of the when you shechted this animal or you brought its blood, your intent was to do something wrong with it, to eat it out of its time or out of its place, or or something that was actually taken out of the courtyard, out of its place, or nishpach dama, or if it's blood spilled on the ground and now you can't spritz its blood. So in kachim, any holy carbon that became invalid, to tell you that there's a prohibition to eat anything that is kodesh, because the Torah says over here, you cannot eat it because it's an invalid kodesh, which tells me that a general rule, it's anything that's kodesh that is invalid may not be eaten.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Making a generality based on korban the miluim. I'm just wondering. I mean, miluim is not like any other korban. Miluim had their own definitions and their own. Everything was different about them. That's a one-time thing, and the korban was brought by Moshe Rabbeinu. So how are you making a generalization from korban miluim to anything else but kodesh?
Yeah, great question. That the specifics of that korban are going to be different because it's not a standard. It's a one-time inaugural korban. So how can you learn anything else? It's great. The limud. The answer is that if it was learned from the korban itself, sort of by making a comparison to the korban, you'd be absolutely right. You can't do that because it's a very different korban. Over here, the Gemara is not learning it from the korban itself, but from the superfluous words in the pasuk. The pasuk has extra words, and it says if there's any leftover, you have to burn it. That's sufficient. The fact that the Torah says the nosar needs to be burned, A, and B, the fact that the Torah says that lo yi'achel ki kodeshu, it shall not be eaten because it's holy, that something invalid that's holy, right? The Torah should have said it shall not be eaten because it's a leftover miluim. It's a unique thing. The Torah puts it back into its category, into the general category. It's kodesh, and therefore it cannot be eaten. It's invalid kodesh that cannot be eaten. That tells me that it's a general rule for kodesh. Kodesh that's invalid may not be eaten, because the Torah takes it in the last words of this pasuk and says, this may not be eaten because it's invalid kodesh. And the Torah does not say it may not be eaten because it's a leftover miluim. Or just scratch that last verse, the last part of the pasuk, because it already said you have leftovers, which are beyond the time it's supposed to be eaten. It shall not be eaten. It should be burned. Period. The fact that the Torah says lo yiyachal ki kodeshu tells me that this is a general rule for kodesh. If it's invalid, it may not be eaten. All right. I can't see you nodding your head.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, I had to move my thumb to unmute. Yes. Thank you. Shkoyach.
Amar Abaye. So Abaye says, actually, you're right. We're not going to learn it from the Basar Miluim, from the remainder meats of the inaugural ceremony. La'olam mikra kama. So we're back to the first verse. It's from the blood of a chatas, a sin offering that was brought into the inner chamber, which invalidates the chatas. And there it says it needs to be burned and may not be eaten. And the Gemara says that really it should have been written differently. The Torah should just say it needs to be burned. And that's sufficient for me to know. It needs to be burned. I can't eat it. If it's burned, I can't eat it. I don't need the pasuk to tell me that I can't eat it. So why did the Torah say that I cannot eat it? So it's not for the specific of that particular korban, but something more general. The nafkalei Rabbi Lazar, as we already learned from Rabbi Lazar, as Rabbi Lazar says that that it needs to be burned, and it can't, and you can't eat it. Taneu inyan, so it must be for all Yisur and Shabbat Torah, all prohibitions in the Torah to tell us that that you're not allowed to benefit from it when it says you shall not eat it. But if it's superfluous and you burn it in a fire, that's superfluous. But to tell us that you're not allowed to benefit from it, as we already know that it needs to be burned. And it can't be just to tell me prohibition in benefit in eating, because we already know that by each prohibition. So it must be telling us that when the Torah says you're not allowed to eat it, you're also not allowed to benefit from it. So Gemara says, from back to the question, well, then every other prohibited item should be, you should have to burn it. That which remains is burned. That part we can already learn from the superfluous word that of what remains needs to be burned, to tell you that only remainder needs to be burned. Kachim, that's left over, needs to be burned. Other prohibitions that you're not allowed to benefit from do not get burned. Amalei Rav Papa Abaye. So Rav Papa tells Abaye that this won't work either. Maybe it's true that it needs to be burned, but maybe the Torah wants to give you a prohibition to eat it. I know that I can infer that you don't need to eat, that you're not allowed to eat it, but it wants to tell me a prohibition that you can't eat it. The Imid Rabbi Lazar, and even though that it's true, Rabbi Lazar already had a generalization that says that you're not allowed to eat anything that's kodesh, may not be eaten because it's invalid. It's true. We do have that generalization, but we know that there's a rule. Whenever there's a lav shebechalolos, a general prohibition, not specific to a scenario or to an item, that there's no penalty, even though that it's prohibited, there's no penalty for the prohibition. The Beis Din will not give a corporal punishment for a lav shebechalolos, a generalization prohibition. And where did Rabbi Lazar learn his prohibition from? The general prohibition, don't eat it because it's kodesh, that's invalid. That tells us that anything that's holy, kodesh, invalid, it may not be eaten. But that's a generalization, a general rule for the entire category. That's called a lav shebechalolos, a prohibition that's a generalization, a generalized prohibition, and there's no penalty for it, even though it is indeed prohibited. So maybe the Torah says a specific prohibition by the chatas, where the blood was brought into the inner chamber, to tell you may not eat it and you need to burn it, or burn it and they may not eat it, to tell you that there's a general that the general prohibition, which does apply, is specific here and that there is a penalty. Because in because the general prohibition, there's no corporal punishment for it. Ela Amar Rav Papa Mehacha. So Rav Papa says, you're right, we're going to have to go to a new source. The Torah says, "V'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei." The kachim meat, which touched tamei meat, lo yachel, may not be eaten, be'esh tisaref, and must be burned in fire. And so it tells us a prohibition for some kachim that became tamei may not be eaten. Now, if it says already at the end of the verse, you have to burn it. So I know you're not allowed to eat it. And we know you're not allowed to eat it from the verse itself and from Rabbi Elazar. So why did the Torah specifically say you may not eat it? So it must not come for itself alone, but rather for the general teaching. It itself, I already know you're not allowed to eat. And I can learn it from a kal v'chomer. Mimaser hakal. So the Gemara here says, I would know that it's prohibited in benefit to be eaten from maser, from the tithe. The Torah says in regards to maser and the tithe, that somebody tithes and then they have to eat. The halacha is you have to do a vidu maaser. At the end of the year, when that crop is over, you have to say, I took care of the maaser, the tithe, and I ate it and only when it was appropriate to eat it. And I did not consume it when it was tamei. So if that's true for maaser, for sure that's true for kachim, that I cannot consume it when it's tamei. Basa kodesh chamer l'kol. Basa kodesh is even stricter because you can only be eaten in certain times in certain places. It has many. It has stringencies. So for sure it would be prohibited. I'm not allowed to eat it. So therefore, the Torah saying I can't eat it, I must burn it, is superfluous. If you're going to tell me, yeah, but I can't learn an initial prohibition from a kal v'chomer from something else. Hekeshu. So it's actually not a kal v'chomer, a logical conclusion, but the words of the Torah tell me that it's prohibition. The Chsifra, it says, you may not eat in your own gates the tithe of your grains, the tithe of your wine, the tithe of your oil, and the korbanos. So the Torah juxtaposes them. The Torah tells it that they're all the same halacha, and that you're not allowed to eat it out of its right place. And therefore, I learn that I'm not allowed to eat it in tamei as well. So why does the Torah say a specific prohibition that I'm not allowed to eat the meat when it's tamei? It must be not be there just for itself. Must be there to tell you generalization that all prohibitions that are prohibited in eating may not be benefited from either. It's not there to tell you that cannot be eaten because we're talking about something that it says you may not eat. And it must be telling you that you need to burn it. You're not allowed to benefit from it, but you don't have to burn it, as we just said several times. If here you have to burn it, perhaps everywhere you have to burn it. Only noser, only kachim, remainder of kachim, but other things do not have the obligation of being burned. So we now have a new source. This is a third verse in regards to the Torah's prohibition of eating kachim that are tamei. It's superfluous to say don't eat it, burn it, because we already know you can't eat it because the Torah puts it together with maser, and it's superfluous to say that you eat it because you can burn it. It says you should burn it. Therefore, we know that it's not speaking about itself alone. It's speaking about a general rule left over. So all prohibitions that you may not eat, you may not benefit from, but you don't have to burn it because only the leftovers have to be burned. Other things do not have to be. Amalei Ravina or Ravashi. So Ravina said to Ravashi, "Ve'ema lava or lav b'shnei lava." Perhaps it's coming to tell you two separate prohibitions. You're right. We already know from the tithe, from Maaser, that kachim is similar to it, and there's a prohibition to eat from it. But maybe the Torah wanted you to transgress twice, and we see that there is such a thing. Lav mi amar Abaye. Had not Abaye told us a rule, Ochal potisa, if somebody eats some sort of sea creature that is prohibited, it's non-kosher sea creature. Loka arba, he transgresses 4 corporal punishments. 2 in regards to the general fish that are not kosher. The Torah says 2 prohibitions for that, and 2 for general prohibitions of tamei, non-kosher creepy crawlies. Namala, if somebody eats an ant, a bug, like a chamish, then you have 5 prohibitions, 2 in regards to the general prohibition of forbidden creepy crawlies, and 3 specific to creepy crawlies on the land. We turn the page. Tzira, if somebody eats a fly, which is a flying creepy crawly, Like a sheish, there's an additional one for the general prohibition of flying creatures that are not kosher. So you see that the Torah will give multiple prohibitions for one thing, and you transgress more prohibitions when you do so. So why do you say, well, we already have a prohibition, must be it's coming to teach us something else? Maybe it's coming to teach us that it has its own multiple prohibitions. Amarle said to him, no, wherever it could be telling us something new or some other idea, then that's what it's coming for. It's only when there's nothing else to tell us, it's simply talking about itself. Like in the bugs, where the Torah just simply says twice, do not eat the forbidden fish. So it's just saying that to itself and nothing else. But aren't we saying that it's coming to teach us extra prohibitions, extra lav? Isn't it coming to teach us extra prohibitions? And it's not coming to teach us extra prohibitions. It's coming to teach us a new teaching. Now, now, there's at the beginning of the verse, there's also a pasuk. It says, the meat that touches tameh shall not be eaten. Now, the end of the verse says it shall be burned. The beginning, what I need it for? L'rabbis, eitzim, u'levona, to tell us that even non-foods that are kodesh, that became tameh, that there's a specific prohibition with them as well, that they become tameh, even though that they're not food. And at the end it says, and that meat which is tahor, which remained okay, anybody that's tahor may eat it. Anybody that they themselves are pure may eat it. Basa the sefer lamali. So what I need that for? Rabbi say murim, to tell you that that the limbs itself that go on the mizbeach, if they became tameh, and somebody transgressed and ate them, and they're not supposed to be eaten, they in general was supposed to not be food. They're supposed to go on the mizbeach. And here, so even a kohen may not eat it, and not only that, but it became tameh. So now there's a double prohibition. It may not be eaten because only a kohen is allowed to eat it, and on top of that, but even a kohen may not eat it, and on top of that, it's tameh, so nobody would be allowed to eat it, and therefore to tell us an additional prohibition for that. L'Rabbi say amurim. So the Gemara says, "Emurim mehasam nafka." Is that really the source for to tell you that limbs that go on the mizbeach, the innards that go on the mizbeach, and that's even a kohen is not supposed to eat it? That if it became tameh, there's a transgression in eating it. Mahasam nafka. We have another place for it. The Tani we learned if somebody were to eat the meat of a shlamim offering, asher lashem, that which goes to Hashem, right? And there it says that if they were to eat something that was supposed to go on the mizbeach, v'tumasa alav, and he is tameh, that there's a transgression, and not only that his soul gets cut off. It's a severe transgression. L'Rabbi Samurim, and there we say that it includes, because it says Lashem, that which goes to the Hashem, meaning the part that goes onto the Mizbeach. So Gemara says there's two types of tumah. There's somebody that eats kachim, the korban itself became tameh, and they're eating it when it's invalid because it itself is tameh. There is another way that one can transgress, where the korban itself is valid, but they have the impurity. They are tameh. The person eating it is tameh, and that's what that pasuk is talking about. Hasa matumas haguf, the kares. There, it's telling you that there's a severe punishment of kares. The soul is cut off from its source when they eat kachim while the person itself is tameh. Hacha tumas basar. Here, it's talking about the limb. The korban itself is tameh, and the belav, that's a lesser prohibition. It's only a prohibition. So the pasuk is coming to tell us these two prohibitions, and we have the meaning of the beginning of the pasuk and the end of the pasuk. And this concludes the section on how we know chametz is prohibited in benefit, and the three opinions of the sources, either Chizkiah, who says from the fact that it says lo ye'achil in the reflexive, from Rabbi Abba, who says as a general rule when the Torah says you may not eat something, it means you're not allowed to benefit from it, or according to Shua Levi, the three attempts from various verses of Korban where there's extra, the Torah says superfluously that it becomes tameh, that it needs to be burned and may not be eaten, or it's invalid, it may not be eaten, to tell you that you're not allowed to, not only for itself, but a general rule, anything that's may not be eaten may not be benefited from. Amar Rabbi Abo, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, a new teaching. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Bo said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kalishun Shabbat Torah, whenever the Torah says you're not allowed to eat something, Ein Lokin Aleim Ela Derech Achilasim, you're only going to get punished, even though the prohibition is there, but the penalty is only going to come if you eat it in a typical manner. Lemiute mai, and what would that exclude? If somebody eats the forbidden fats, chelev, but he eats it raw, that's not a normal way to eat it. The pater, even though you're not allowed to do so, it will not count. You will not be liable to punishment for it. Ikeda Amri, that those that say that this statement of Rabbi Abo in the name of Rabbi Yochanan was said this way. Amar Rabbi Abo, Rabbi Yochanan, Kalisun Shabbat Torah and Lokin Aleihen Ela Derech Ha'asan. Anything that you're not allowed to benefit from, you're only going to be held accountable, meaning you're only going to get punished if you actually do so in a typical manner. Lemiute mai, and what does that exclude? Amar Rabbi Tzvi Fischer, Lemiute shemeniach chelev shel shora niskal agabe makaseh. The shora niskal, we said, the ox that has to be put down on account of goring and killing, that you're not allowed to benefit from it. If somebody took the fats from there and put it on a wound and to moisturize the skin over a wound, that's an abnormal type of oils of fats to use for for moisturizing skin, and it would not count as a normal form of benefiting from these forbidden fats. Shu pater, and therefore he will not be held liable, even though that it's prohibited. The kolshke, and for sure, if you eat this chelev raw, you're going to be exempt because it's an atypical way of eating. It manami amar Rav bar Avia amar Ravasi amar Rabbi Yochanan name Rabbi Yochanan niach shara niskal chelev shara niskal gabi makasei pater. Somebody takes the fats of a forbidden that are forbidden in benefit from a shara niskal, from a ox that was put down that on top of a wound as healing and soothing, is going to be exempt because all prohibitions of the Torah, you're only going to be held accountable if you do so in a typical manner. We learned this as well. Rabbi Zera says it's in a brisa, because it says in you're not allowed, you will not get punished for benefiting from arla, which we saw earlier. Arla, in the first 3 years, the produce may not be benefited from. Ella, from a tree. Ella ala yetzim and azeisim ananav. But you'll only be held accountable and get a punishment for that which comes out of olives and out of grapes, meaning wine and oil. Belvad. The ilu mitutzim teinav harmonim. But if you squeeze berries, you're not going to be, or other things that are not typical, figs that are not generally squeezed, so then you're not going to be held accountable. So my time, what's the reasoning of that brisa? Isn't it because it's an atypical way of using it? Abaye said, no, that's not the reason. Tomorrow we'll see Abaye's response. It's not because it's not a typical way, or rather because it's not juice. It's just liquids being squeezed out. And we'll continue with this tomorrow.